On your screen is author Kori Schake. The book is called State of Repair, Fixing the Culture and Practices of the State Department. Kori Schake, you write that the Department of State employee roster consists of roughly 7,800 Foreign Service officers, 11,000 civil servants, and 42,000 foreign nationals. In 2009, 16,000 applicants took the written test to join the Foreign Service, competing for roughly 1,000 jobs. The people selected have college degrees, 11 years of prior work experience before coming into the Foreign Service. 2/3 of the people selected for the Foreign Service come in with postgraduate degrees. 80% have lived overseas. Foreign Service officers are awarded tenure after 4 years. 95% of the serving officers receive tenure. 25% of all our diplomats are concentrated in only 30 countries, more than 2,000 in Iraq and Afghanistan. What's wrong with state?
Well, there are several things wrong with state. Although it is an institution that ought to be good at its job and could be with careful managerial attention over a little period of time, the main problem is that even by their own description, they are not hiring people who have the skills they say they need for contemporary diplomacy. So they're not hiring the right people. As you just pointed out, they keep them all, and they don't teach them anything in the meantime. The State Department expends all of its training resources on teaching languages, and yet of the jobs requiring language proficiency in the State Department, 25% of them, by state's own reckoning, are filled by people who cannot effectively use the language. Another 25% by people who are not easily proficient in the language. So they have a 50% failure rate by their own standard on the sole area that they expend their training resources on. It's not a good business model.
Why is there a 50% failure rate, as you call it?
Yeah. So the way that the State Department, the career progression is that you take a diplomatic post, you're assigned to a diplomatic post for a couple of years, and then after that you go to language training and then go someplace else. We develop generalists in the American Foreign Service. We don't develop experts. So, for example, a talented young Foreign Service officer may be posted in Baghdad, and then, this is actually an example of someone I know, she will go to a couple of years language training and then be sent to Beijing. And so...
Language training in Arabic?
She will have had language training to go to Iraq, but probably not enough so that she would have felt comfortable having a discussion like you and I are now having in the language of the country she was operating in. And then she will get a year or two of language training and then be sent to China. It's an extraordinarily profligate professional development model. And I would just point out that kids come into the Palo Alto School District speaking 132 different languages already. We could actually hire people who have the language skills that we want. We don't actually have to teach them all that. So it's a business model that you would never start with. And the culture of the State Department replicates, they select people who have the skills of the people already there. So the example that you pointed out, the Foreign Service actually has an admissions rate, the equivalent of Stanford University. You have as high a likelihood of getting admitted into Stanford as you have of becoming a member of the U.S. Foreign Service. We ought to be able to pick anyone we want. And the people we pick are very good, but the institution doesn't make them any better over time. And that's something we should fix.
Why do you quote Secretary Rice, former Secretary Rice, as saying, state has Pentagon envy?
Yeah, what she meant by that is that there's a defensiveness to the culture of the U.S. State Department that, for my favorite example of it is Secretary Clinton's quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. This was a great thing she did. It was the first time a Secretary of State had done it. She did a once every 4 years look at the institution to set priorities. And it was a good first start, but it's got a long ways to go before it's an effective management review. And one way you can tell that is that Secretary Clinton opened it by saying, we set out to figure out how to make ourselves better. And the conclusion they came to is, if you only gave us more money and more people, we could be better. And so the vision of the Pentagon from the State Department is that they get all the money they want, that the work that the Foreign Service does is every bit as difficult and dangerous, and yet everyone likes the military and there's no constituency for foreign policy in this country.
Why don't the American people like the State Department? Why don't they think much about the State Department?
So only 2 million Americans avail themselves of consular service overseas every year. So it's not a very high number in a country of 310 million people. So I think the first thing is most Americans don't know their diplomats, right? They're mostly posted overseas. The Foreign Service Institute, where they do their training, is here in Washington. So in Spokane, Washington State, or Duluth, Minnesota, they probably don't know them. And the Foreign Service could actually do itself a huge favor by stitching itself more closely into American society. I have some suggestions in the book for ways they could do that. One would be that what American diplomats like about themselves is complicated multinational negotiations, things like the climate change discussions in Copenhagen, right? Because it's hard, it's intellectually difficult to master the material, there are lots of moving pieces. What Americans actually value about the State Department is if your brother gets arrested in El Salvador, an American diplomat's going to go see him in jail, make sure that he's being treated fairly, ensure that the protections that any American citizen should have anywhere in the world are afforded him. And the State Department views that as its least important responsibility. The culture doesn't reward it. Its most talented people don't go into consular affairs. There was a study done recently suggesting that, so the State Department complains that after September 11th, so much funding and attention went to security and consular affairs. And yet, American diplomats are the first line of defense for protection of our country. They're the people who give visas to foreigners who might come to the United States. And the people who do that are our youngest Foreign Service officers. It's a required first tour to be posted somewhere doing. Their workload is enormous, and they don't get lots of attention, and yet they do it fantastically. Why doesn't the State Department celebrate those young diplomats? Because my mom would actually be thrilled. That would make her like the Foreign Service. But seeing an undersecretary come sweeping out of the Copenhagen negotiations doesn't do much for my mom.
Well, Kori Schake, for those who have traveled overseas and actually tried to visit one of our embassies, it's nearly impossible. It's a fortress.
This is actually not the State Department's fault. The Congress, out of concern about protecting American diplomats, and in particularly after the bombings of the American embassies in Nairobi in the Clinton administration, Congress started legislating much better protection. But it has the dysfunctional outcome that you say. It's actually not making American diplomats safer because it's so difficult to get into an American embassy that they go out to have their meetings. So they are less well protected, although they are doing their jobs well. They're out and about in foreign societies, being the American that people see.
I'm going to read a quote that you have here in your book. Tell us who this is from. Washington awoke, a capital at war. The indecisions, hesitations, and doubts of the past year, the pretenses and fumblings were gone. Argument over, the country and its capital turned to what Americans like and do best, action. In a few months, half a continent and 130 million people were transformed into the greatest military power the world had seen. Amid this burst of energy, the State Department stood breathless and bewildered, like an old lady at a busy intersection during rush hour. What is that from?
Yeah, it is Dean Acheson writing on December 8th, 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. He was, at that time, the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, and he was exasperated to see that the State Department wasn't better at its job when he goes on to say further on in